I really liked the metaphor that Schaefer used of beginning teaching as joining a parade that's already in progress and just trying. She talks about how you're like on the side and you're just sort of waiting to jump into the parade and find your spot. And then I sort of thought about it as like, well, if you get in the wrong spot, like a float can run over you.
Yes.
Or if you get on a right spot, you could end up on that float, and you could have the other teachers pulling you in, basically, to be part of that. And so really, it's like, what part of the parade are you joining? Which group in the parade are you joining? When you're going to work at a school board, which is different than our context,
Yes.
which school do you end up in could be that point in the parade that you're sort of being pushed from behind to go in, and it's not necessarily the part of the parade that's the best fit for you.
Exactly. There was another one similar to that was talking about how it's like trying to get on the bus, and the idea that teachers are all waiting at the bus stop, waiting for the bus to show up, and the bus is what's going to take them out of the profession, and the idea that we're just sort of sitting and waiting. Teachers standing at a bus stop waiting for their bus to come by and take them away or to a new place offers a way of thinking about the intentions of beginning teachers, which is the same idea, or even how you're going to join that parade. Are you going to jump and get up on the float, or are you just going to sort of slot yourself in among the marching band and follow in?
So from the Guarino report, they were looking at what characteristics describe the people who go into teaching. And one of the things that really caught my attention in that was that teaching was seen as sort of being an attractive career when it fit the person's abilities and skills, but not necessarily something that they really felt was their like highest achievement. So for example, exactly, or calling. So for some people it is a calling, and that those people in the end might be the ones that really try and stick it out through the difficult first few years. But for other people, they're going into teaching because the salary is okay to start, and they know that it's going to increase over time, but also they're just lacking other opportunities or other fields to go into, because they're not, as the report showed, they're not the highest achieving or highest capable in their university programs. So they're looking for alternatives for work.
Yeah, and a lot of what I've heard from just communications with other friends or colleagues that try and get into teaching, it's the benefits that draw them in. They know they have a pension plan, they know that they'll have their health and dental covered, their summers off,
An extended Christmas break.
the March break. And it's not always the case, but there is a lot of talk around what they get out of it as opposed to what they can
Put into it.
put in. In the article on early career teacher attrition, one of the first lines was that researchers report that the best and the brightest among the newcomers appear to be the most likely to leave, which was shocking because the best, the brightest, the strongest are the ones that are the most effective.
Well, and maybe once they get into working conditions that are not what they thought they were going to be, they realize that they're capable and able to go do something else.
Yeah.
And so those are the ones who are more likely to feel confident that they can go out and find a different career opportunity. I think as well with that, one of the quotes that came from the Guarino, or some of the research, was that it's often people who work in math and science which have a strong demand for careers outside, and also higher salary for careers outside of teaching.
Yeah, and then I was also thinking, well, the best and the brightest probably got to be the best and the brightest because of their work ethic and their drive. So by nature, they're going to be the ones that will be looking for something more, trying to advance themselves, expand, create their own, I guess, ladder to climb up.
Rather than just sort of being stagnant in a teaching position once they've achieved tenure.
Yeah.
In the article by Long, they were talking about the video personal observations and reflections, and I know that you had some experience with that as a student teacher, and they really highlighted that it wasn't very fruitful in performing personal assessment for their teachers, and I thought maybe you could talk about that from your experience, since I haven't actually done any video observations of myself.
I quite loved that process. It was not an easy one, and I fought it for a bit, but what I really liked is that it gave me an opportunity to view myself from my students' perspective, and it's one of the few assignments that I actually found very beneficial to helping me advance as a teacher out of all the things that were given to me in my undergrad, and I found it valuable because I got to sit back and develop my own opinions about how I teached, and it was very concrete. And sort of what I was saying before is that if your cooperating teacher or your mentor says something about your teaching or your approach, it can easily be viewed as their opinion. So you can sort of take it or leave it.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see it for yourself on video, it makes it concrete and real and something that you can act on, which is what I liked about the video portion of it. I got to see myself and go, whoa, can't believe I look like that. But I think what they were getting at in the article as to why it's not fruitful is it's a very uncomfortable process. And I think a lot of people and a lot of my classmates were turned off by it. Because as soon as it's on video and recorded, it makes it real. And you can't dismiss it like you would dismiss a comment by a colleague.
And in your case, were your professors viewing the video as well?
Yeah.
So they're seeing you in action. And I think that's part of what makes people fear assessment in some way of our teaching is that it can be intrusive.
Yes.
With the program we have at our school right now, where we're having our colleagues come into our classes, for some people that's still very threatening.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's not necessarily someone of a higher authority like an administrator, it's still a colleague that you know is asked to be observing and in some way be critical of what's happening in the classroom, and we feel that's intrusive. So I think if you can take these videos and only make it personal, for personal viewing, personal growth, personal development, then it might lessen that feeling of discomfort and vulnerability if you know that no one else is going to be watching and commenting on those.
Yes, and that was sort of, when we did it, we had to display our videos for the entire class. And all our peers were also evaluating us. But one of the things that the professor had us do, which really helped, is she gave us all pieces of paper, and it had cool points and warm points. Cool points being the things that we might want to, if we were teaching that lesson, we would do differently, or how we'd modify it, and the warm points are things that we liked or wanted to replicate. And that sort of helped break down. It wasn't the good, the bad. It was, what would you take? What would you change? And then the way it was also explained is, my professor said, don't view this as a critical evaluation. View it as practice with discomfort. And she said, because people are going to be coming in and out of your classrooms for years, and you need to be able to go with the flow. And a video camera, while an inanimate object, can make you uncomfortable. So you should get used to the idea of people coming in and interrupting your flow. But that was what helped me, is that the video was viewed as a part of a learning process, part of a community growth, and it wasn't a one-time thing. So we videotaped ourselves multiple times. So we got to see how the improvement in the growth happened. And the video itself was not evaluated, but what we did with the video was. So I think the video portion can be very, very beneficial, but it needs to be taught or integrated into the teaching process the same way we would have to teach and integrate personal reflections into the curriculum. It can't just be tossed in with our fingers crossed, hoping it's going to be beneficial.
And I was thinking about personal reflection since you just mentioned it, and the Schaefer article, and reading her personal narrative really made me think about the first reflection I wrote for this reading course, in which I was thinking about my own first few years, but also how I hadn't really documented any of that as it was happening. So now it's 10 years later, and I'm going back and I'm starting to think about all these things and all these events, and I really started to think more about throughout the year all the reflection that I do, but none of it actually becomes tangible reflection, that it sort of happens in thought and in passing. And is it because I don't choose to write those things down, or is it just that I have zero time to do that? I'm not prioritizing it. I'm not making it a priority to put these things down on paper because I'm sort of just grinding away trying to get through the year and just survive the year. That I don't necessarily see the benefit of that reflection time until later.
I do a lot of reflection. I do at least 3 or 4 times a week. I've got piles of journals going, and I just jot down simple things. Sometimes it's just I slap a sticky note in there to highlight on it later, but I don't tend to look back on them that often. So I'm not entirely sure why I do that. Every now and then I'll look back and I'll laugh at what I wrote and go, God, I can't believe that was what I viewed as an issue. And it's nice to sort of see that growth. But for me, it's by putting it down on paper, it becomes, again, concrete and will force me to act or work on it.
And I think that's one of the things that can become redundant in teaching, is that if we just keep going over and over our year, the same thing over and over, and we're not actually doing these reflections, then we're not growing as teachers, and it just becomes sort of this cyclical process that we become sort of a slave to.
I also think reflection's difficult because it's at times means admitting when you've done something wrong or haven't been as successful as you'd attempted to, which opens up that vulnerability. And that scares people.
We had read about a lot this concept of professional and personal identity. And I think we could probably speak a lot about that because of being in the independent school system, where the community and the pride and the history of the schooling or the professional identity is incredibly strong. There's opportunity to bring personal identity in, but I think one of the things I find about working in an independent school is you pretty much have to bleed the color of the school, in a sense. There's a strong commitment to that, which is great because it does make people, I think, more committed to the student body, the student life, but also can pull from your personal identity pretty significantly, because you can become torn between your personal beliefs and then following the professional beliefs or the professional expectations. Perhaps.
It's sort of the assimilation versus I'm forgetting the other word.
Is it actually lived by each individual faculty member within the school, or does their personal identity, is it allowed to be infused? And I think that's a lot of what those articles were touching on, is what is the flexibility between those two identities, or are there such strong barriers that people have to really sort of live their professional identity completely separate from their personal identity and their personal beliefs within their classrooms?
I think if it gets to the point where they have to live those two lives independently, then there's a mismatch between the school environment and the teacher. I don't think it should ever get to that point. I think you may need to adjust some of what you do. Like, I can tell you I do not believe in standardized testing, but I work in a province that values that heavily, so I have to adjust according to that. But if any of my core beliefs and the ones that I hold myself to in my personal life, if those are ever challenged, or if I ever have to disregard those in order to perform my job, that's when I'll exit.
Teacher attrition, where she talked about in her personal narrative, where she went to sit down and talk to a mentor of a new teacher, and they talked about this revival that they had by witnessing the new teacher, and this feeling revitalized by watching them teach. And there's so much that we think about that's focusing on that student teacher or that new teacher in the school, but we also don't think necessarily about the benefit for the group as a whole. As in the teaching community, and the resources that these new teachers are coming in with and not necessarily being harnessed. She wrote in her narrative about going in with a bunch of phys ed lessons and then them just saying, well, we don't need to rework the wheel, we've just follow along, you're new here. And so if you're approaching new teachers with that sort of blatant thanks for coming and you just need to follow along, they're of course never going to feel like they really belong within the community, the school community. And I think that's one of the things too, especially as new teachers, is that you have to feel open, but you have to create that openness in your school community already for the new teachers to feel open.
Yep.
You have your veteran teachers there as well. They also have to be open. Otherwise, you're going to build barriers where people are going to feel like they can't go into each other's classrooms, or they're going to feel that they can't collaborate and share ideas and build together.
Absolutely.
And I think, too, that when people feel that strong disconnect between their personal and their professional identity, and they spend too much time either trying to merge or conform to the professional identity, that's when they burn out or they have to leave the profession because of complete unhappiness in what they're doing.
Yes.
And I think sometimes as well, when people try to merge them and there's a lot of resistance on the professional side, meaning through the school, where the school's not being as flexible in incorporating that, is also where they decide to leave. So really, there's two sort of instances where that can play a negative in the teacher's life.
Yes, and early career teacher attrition, they spoke about that and saying how that they suggested that teachers have these stories to live by, and they're gradually shifted until they found that they were no longer able to either sustain who they were or were becoming within the school context.
Yeah. One of the other reasons mentioned for why teachers leave the profession, specifically female teachers, is a balance between family and work life. And those two things, and I think we felt some tension on that because of myself as a mom and trying to balance those things. I see instances where I know that teaching is taking away from my family life, and then I see instances where I know that it's enhancing my family life.
Yes.
So in the summers when I'm better able to spend that time with my child that I'm not through the year, and with understanding of the education system and being able to support my child through that, and also having the working hours that are a little bit more conducive to school drop-offs and school pickups. So there is definitely some balance there, but then there are other times where I know that sometimes my relationships are suffering because of the time commitment and investment that I have to put into my career. And having been involved already in the school prior to having a family, I guess it's almost, you spend your first few years teaching, never saying no to anything. And then how do you smoothly move to having a family life and then being able to say no?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. But I too disagreed with the idea that you couldn't be a great teacher and have a great home or personal life. I think that's just a cop-out if that's your excuse for leaving. Because in any career, in any job, you're going to have to work to find that balance. But one of the things that drew me to teaching was that I thought I would be better able to manage working and having a family, because family life is important to me, and I didn't want to be the mom who's leaving work at 8 o'clock and rushing to soccer practice and this and that and board meetings. I knew I wanted a career, and I thought this way I will be in a career that I absolutely love, but when I choose to have kids, I know I'll be able to pick them up from school. We can go on adventures in the summer, and my career will already be geared towards my kids' schedule to some degree. So I think a balance definitely has to be found, and it's not just going to magically appear. It has to be worked on. But if we say that being a teacher prevents you from having a good family life, then how do we explain lawyers and doctors and every other time-consuming profession on the planet?
I was also thinking about how a lot of the new teachers, and it's mentioned as well through the literature that we've been reading, that they really feel this competitiveness at the beginning of their career and their need to prove themselves.
Yes.
And I think it has a lot to do with that lack of job security and this getting shifted around.
Yep.
And it's sort of, and this is one question that I still have that's coming to me, is that how do you increase their job security, or at least make them feel secure in their job? Because I think that in itself is having a huge impact on new teachers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's difficult because a lot of them are getting these replacement contracts and they know that they're really there for 1 year, so they're not building this relationship in the school that they're at. But it's still a question that I have and would want to explore further, is how could you possibly modify the current system for new teachers coming into these jobs, and how do you allow them to feel more secure in their jobs so that they feel that they can connect and perform to their highest ability.
I've been thinking about that a lot as well, and one of the thoughts I've had along that is that we might need to take a look at what other industries do and how they integrate or bring in novices.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking lawyers, for example, who do internships during their law degrees and do a lot of articling and are brought on by a firm and trained and supported and monitored very, very closely. They are worked like dogs, but there is that constant monitoring, and the idea is usually that based on your performance during that internship, that you'll be brought on as an associate for the firm, where you will, again, be worked like a dog, but you will not have a whole lot of independence. So you've got one of the partners overseeing what you do, so that you're learning, but you've also got someone who's there to watch your back. Mm-hmm. And then as you grow and develop, you are given more independence and moved on to different positions. But the idea is that you're new, you're supported, and then as you grow and prove yourself, that's when you're given the more difficult tasks, the more demanding workloads, and the more independence.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're sort of talking about a mentorship program, but with a lot more structure to the mentorship.
And even
or at least more responsibility onto the mentor.
Yeah, even going beyond that into viewing how we bring in new teachers and almost changing the hiring process. And I was actually talking to my sister about this, and she goes, there's no way that could happen. I said, probably not in a 1 year thing or with a change of policy, but with the idea of bringing teachers in, like I'm thinking their last stage, bringing them on with the idea that if they do well, you would hire them. Mm-hmm. So that support is there, and the student teacher or the novice teacher knows that there's the potential for the permanent position. There's that buy-in from both sides. Mm-hmm. And while there might not be a guarantee of a job, there's we're going to support the novice teacher because we want them to do well and be part of this community. And then the novice teachers buying in because they know that if they work well and they contribute and they immerse themselves in this culture, that it will be beneficial.
Employment, right?
Yeah.
A long-term employment. And that's interesting because one of the questions that I was thinking about too was leading to more co-teaching.
Yes.
I love the concept of co-teaching, and even not just necessarily with new teachers, but I think there's a huge benefit to if you do that with new teachers in your school.
Yeah.
Co-teaching, so that as long as you're picking the veteran teacher carefully,
yes,
to work with the co-teacher. So it's not just somebody who they're being placed with who's saying let's not reinvent the wheel, let's just do it how we've always done it, but a co-teaching relationship that allows both of those teachers to share ideas and grow and develop the program that they're teaching.
Yes. Yeah, and making it a partnership and staying away from this teacher looks like they might burn out, so let's plop someone else in there to help them out.
Yeah, it's not just a Band-Aid to a problem. It has to be something that allows for professional growth and also allows for support of the new teacher and coming into the school. And that's when you look at the improving working conditions, I think it's sort of difficult to have new teachers come in who are not having this mishmash of workloads, but it's a necessity that needs to be dealt with, because when we're bringing in these people who are being asked to teach something that's not their teachables, not what
Yeah.
they've studied, not what they're considered in quotations an expert in, much like Schaefer wrote about with her physical education experience. If you're asking them to come in and teach something that they've never really taught before, and then they're on their own to do it, and they're not in this co-teaching relationship, then it does become this difficult task for them, and they really will feel already somewhat defeated by the fact that they have to teach something that they're not trained in teaching.
Yeah, so they've got that hurdle to deal with, is developing the new process for how do you teach kindergarten when you're a high school teacher, and then you've also got the hurdle of how do I do this on my own? How do I manage the fact that I am brand new to this career in general? It's it sounds scary when you lay it out. Yeah.
There was mention in the Guarino research about campaigns to sort of augment the prestige of the teaching profession, and I think in our own society there's already a lot of negative view towards being a teacher in the teaching
Ton
profession, and
of
people
negative.
constantly pull up their own previous experiences with teachers that was not a positive experience, and has led them to have distrust in the education system, or distrust in their relationships with teachers and questioning teachers. And I think that's still another question that comes about for me, is how do we increase the prestige of the profession itself, and is it through making it a more competitive career to become a teacher?
Yes. I feel strongly on that. I'm just going to interject. People often say that education is the back door to McGill, which hurts, being someone who takes a lot of pride in the faculty. But I think there needs to be more rigor in who's selected, who's brought in, and the competition needs to be higher, because it's a profession, whether recognized or not. We're professionally trained. We should only be allowing competent individuals in and out that program. There needs to be some sort of process that forces those applying to critically analyze why they are going into it, and to make sure that there is a compatibility between the individual, their goals and ambitions, and the programming and career, whether that be through writing personal statements, having references, or doing an interview. I know a lot of schools in the US will do interviews, and I remember going through that process myself, wanting to do an education master's degree, where I was actually required to go down and spend a couple days at the school that I'd be doing my internship at, so that they could essentially vet me, and they wanted to see that if there was a connection between me and the school before they accepted me, and I was required to be accepted by that internship before the university would even accept me into the program. So there was that idea that they wanted to make sure that all their applicants were truly committed to the program, to the profession. I don't think we do that enough. It's okay, you want to be a teacher? Okay, here you go. Ta-da.
We have spaces to be filled, so we just sort of slot people
Yeah.
into those spaces to fill them.
Yes.
And it's interesting because Finland is always used as the perfect example for an education system, and they do talk about how all the teachers have master's degrees. And so I know McGill has now their program, or if you've completed an undergraduate program, you can do the master's program, which I think in some instances, when we look at teachers and we think about their training and the amount of time that they do invest in it, that if they're willing to invest more time in education to achieve the profession, then they are more likely to remain in the profession because of the investment that they've made.
Yes. Absolutely. And if you're going to stick with it for that long, you'll have consciously made several decisions along the way, committing yourself to it. I'm thinking if it was a 1-year diploma, I do it, and then, well, we'll see if I like it or not. But if I don't really like it, well, it's 1 year out of my entire life. Whereas if it's several years, well, I'm going to be pretty sure that that's what I want to do before I commit 4 or 5 years to that training.
And the one article, it's Clendenin was the author. There was a quote that I really liked that said, "Sustaining beginning teachers requires that we know them as people," and it made me think a lot about this concept of a relational school.
Yes.
And that for students, the most important part of their learning is their relationship with their teacher.
Yeah.
And that by having a positive relationship with their teacher. But I also think that based on this article and based on what we're seeing throughout the literature that we're reading, is that the relationship that the new teacher has, not only to the school, not only to their students, but also to their mentor and to their administration,
Yes.
that they really aren't just this person coming in to fill a slot, and they can't be viewed that way. And if they are viewed that way, if it's the signature, "oh well, I don't learn your name unless you're here for more than a year" type approach, which is mentioned in the article and, to be honest, is rampant in schools. If that's the approach that we take to all these new teachers that come into the school, and treat them as being something that is someone who's come in just to fill a void, then they're never going to be sustained.
No, absolutely. And that was one of the things I noted from that article, as well as I wrote, whole person must be considered. And I think you said exactly that, we're not just bringing in a robot who's going to work through the curriculum and then carry on. You're bringing in a human being with experiences, goals, ambitions, their own process and expectations, and they can't just disregard all that. Even if we want to, it's not going to happen.
And I think the mentorship type programs can be used to do that, right? If you're looking at mentors as just being academic advisors for the new teacher and just providing them with academic feedback on their teaching abilities, then it becomes a very not personal relationship.
Yeah.
There's mention in the literature about meeting outside of school, even.
Yes.
Not just being a mentor within the school, but meeting outside the school, which I know for me was a goal with Christine, who was my mentee. When I was first placed with her, I took that role very seriously, knowing that she's coming in only for a 1-year mat leave replacement. But knowing that I'm working with her, wanting to build a relationship with her.
Yes.
And I wasn't her department head at the time, but I knew that I needed to assist this person with their regular routine things, but also with the regular struggles that new, especially younger teachers face, especially disciplinary things with students. And I knew that meeting in the school doesn't really make that strong of a relationship, that it really becomes a professional relationship only. And so what we did was we would go for runs.
Yes.
And we would have conversation, and she was allowed to talk. You also aren't facing the person, which tends to allow for sometimes better conversation when you don't have to look at someone necessarily directly, and you're just able to vent what your experiences are and provide them with some feedback on those situations or some advice on those situations, or even coach them through. Another really useful skill for mentors would be coaching courses.
Oh, absolutely.
And coaching courses, I found from what my own experience was, it's not about giving the person the answer, but it's about helping them lead themselves to the answer.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's huge in mentoring.
And it being their answer, not the right answer, but what process is going to help this individual work through it. Yeah, I would say coaching. I think teachers should be required to take coaching courses. Let's just.
For all teachers?
Yeah, that should be part of our preparation, because a lot of what we do extends beyond
with our students.
Exactly, and we're prepped on how to prepare the curriculum and lessons, but I also think that's another aspect that we miss out on, is how do we deal with all these complex relationships that we're now thrown into. Yeah, and moving back to the mentoring, there was also talk of balance in developing sort of personal relationships with colleagues, where it goes beyond the school context. So going out with colleagues as a group, or setting up social events, be it just going out shopping with a colleague, or staff parties. But I think that's important, especially in the early years when it is so demanding. And a lot of your time is consumed by work, having the ability to go out with someone who's at least gone through what you've gone through and knows the demands, and say, okay, yeah, let's go grab coffee and mark. You're still getting your work done, but it's in a different setting, it's social, and it's like, okay, I'm not
You're not
alone.
Yeah, it's a support system.
Yes.
And you feel like you have a network of people that you can rely on that are in a similar situation as you, or have been in those situations.
Yes.
And then can offer their advice and support.
Yeah, and it won't always work out. Like, you might not find someone at work who you're like, oh, I'm going to be your friend. But having some of that built in already, so staff nights or little social perks for colleagues helps bring them together and creates that more personal relationship.
So I really like the point on continuity of experience, because it talks about building the confidence in the new teacher, having longer induction programs. So it's not just this 1 year transition into the school, but it's something that's building over time. And I also like the idea of fixing their workload.
Yes.
So that they can build their confidence in what they're doing and constantly improve, rather than every year having to constantly change what they're doing because they're being forced by their new workload.
100%. And the long term, what's the word you used?
Continuity?
No, the
Induction?
there we go. The having like a long term induction was sort of what I was getting at by altering the hiring process, and extending that with the idea that you've got to transition from student to teacher, and there should be some sort of continuity between when you are a student teacher and then when you become a teacher.
Yeah, one of the programs that's mentioned in the research was teacher scholars.
Yes.
And I really like that term, because instead of just saying like, oh, they're new teachers and giving them that idea of them being like rookies, by calling them teacher scholars, it means that they're still learning and growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fixed workload is also huge, and I thought long and hard about that, because the number of things that we're expected to do as a new teacher sometimes blows my mind. And it's often said that new teachers, they end up with the difficult classrooms, the heaviest workloads, their extracurriculars are just piled on, and that's done because they don't have the seniority to say otherwise. But that makes no sense to me. Why would you give the most inexperienced person the most difficult classes, or the heaviest schedule, or the most independence? That should be reserved for those who actually know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's the administrator's role to ensure that these new teachers aren't facing these things. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that's not always what's happening. So do you then incorporate a second voice in the school just for new teachers? So if you have a person who's in charge, for example, of the mentoring program within your school, could they also act as a voice for these new teachers? Could they also be someone that the new teachers could consult with and talk to, and then they could be a voice and basically speak on behalf of these new teachers who maybe don't want to say no when they're being asked to do certain things?
Or maybe that's how you bring in co-teaching. So if you do have to hire, you've got a restricted budget, you can only hire one person, but they're going to have to fill up 7 preps. Well, if you're going to hire a brand new teacher who's going to have to do that much work, well, maybe you set it up as a co-teaching, so maybe only 4 of those are classes where they're going to be independent, and the other 3 they're going to be linked up with someone else, so that they can have that sort of support. Because I understand that there are a bunch of factors that need to be considered, but I don't think we're doing our students any benefit by tossing in an inexperienced, overworked individual into the front of the classroom.
Right. In the long article, they were quoting Wood and Stanulus on their criteria of comprehensive quality induction. And the first point, of course, was related to educated mentors. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that point, they talked a lot about which relationships work well in mentorships, and when it becomes a fruitful opportunity in the school. And they talked about the mentee choosing their mentor, which can be difficult, because if you're coming into a new school, you don't necessarily know the people within the school.
Yeah, you don't know the ins and out of the politics and
Exactly, and I know that a lot of the times it's sort of on a volunteer basis where you get these mentors, or you might have to approach teachers as an administrator and ask them if they'd be interested, which I think has way more impact, because I think a lot of teachers in the school don't see themselves as being someone who could potentially be a good mentor, but the administrators can recognize those people better.
yes.
And often, sometimes the people who volunteer are not the people who necessarily would be the most effective mentors.
Yes. The this is going to sound funny, but we had, when I was in high school, there was a group called Peer Mentors, and they were senior students that were chosen to help the grade 9s integrate into high school through their first year. We all had to apply to be these mentors, fill out an application. It was quite a process, and then we were selected by a teacher committee. And if there was someone who hadn't applied and the teachers thought would be a great mentor, they were then personally asked. But it tended to be very effective because people who volunteered actually wanted to be part of that, and then you had that administrative insight. But what was interesting about it is it was initially a group thing, so it was all the mentors with all the incoming students, and then based on those interactions, smaller groups were formed, which could be an interesting way
Of placing people.
Yes, so you have, let's say you've got your 10 teachers that want to be mentors. They've all been, the admin says, you know what, yes, these are all a great group of teachers. I think they'd all be effective mentors. And then you bring in your new hires, and then you just sort of let, over a couple weeks or so, the process.
Like the groupings form, right? The
Yeah.
matches form, because that match is so important. If that match between the mentor and the mentee isn't there, that's already a negative experience for the mentee within the school.
Absolutely, and then I think it's also important to keep that group open. So after a few weeks, once the pairing up has formed, well, that pairing up might not work in all situations. So having that group meeting or that group environment will allow everyone to sort of reintegrate and remix and share some
That
new ideas.
Brings me to another point about the quality induction program, is that it talks about the time
Yeah.
and the time requirement to do that. And I think as administrators, we have to look at releasing those teachers who are becoming mentors so that they have time, not necessarily from their full workload, but obviously a reduced workload, so that they have time to do these meetings. Like, this doesn't necessarily need to be something that's done outside of school hours. Sure, yes, they could be meeting with their individual mentee over time as they build that social relationship, but early on, especially around the beginning of the school year, looking at how can you release those teachers and also have your newer teachers on a slightly reduced workload as well, to be able to integrate this mentorship program into the regular school hours.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't need to be much, and these, I'd say, within a couple hours, even spread out over a couple weeks, this will figure itself out. I'm just thinking of the dynamics that have worked out in classes, how you partner up, who you sit beside. You sort of sort it out, and it can be, to be open, it doesn't have to be incredibly rigid, so that time demand doesn't prevent people from engaging in the program.
And I think you touched on the point about it being, how do we provide the best learning environment for our students? And really, when we look at this issue with new teacher retention or new teacher attrition, if we look at that and think about it from the perspective of the student learning, then we know that our new teachers, just like all of our teachers in the school, have to be happy in what they're doing, and they have to have all of the supports in place.
Yeah.
And a lot of the literature talks about one of the major reasonings for why teachers leave the profession is that they have a lack of support in what they're doing. So putting these systems in place, either through the mentorship, through the administration program, and the induction program, all of that has to be to ensure that the teachers are happy and fulfilling in their role.
Yeah, I think that's important. During one of my stages, said that I said, I so don't want to be in this profession anymore. What was I thinking? And it was because I had a terrible time during my placement, didn't feel supported, and I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to be an effective teacher or be the type of person I want to be in the classroom if this is the environment that I have to work within. And I thought that's not fair to myself, and that's not fair to my students if I am exhausted and on the verge of tears every day and barely able to put together a lesson, let alone deal with all the extra aspects. But thankfully I had a great fourth placement that showed that the environment really impacts. So when the support's there, it's amazing